Open the questions to the floor. A reminder for all of you to speak into the microphone, state who you are, and I'll make sure that I also take some of the questions from our online audience. So by all means, do put questions to our speakers. Lenny Wild, a colleague of mine who's been doing quite a lot of hands-on work with donors in the last few months on changing things from within. Can you share some thoughts on how does it feel like?
Thank you, Marta. Lenny Wild in the Politics and Governance programme here at ODI, and I also got to look at the advanced copy that we had and would like to congratulate both Tom and Diane on a really excellent book, which I think should be required reading for anyone who's working in the field of politics and governance and development more broadly. So congratulations. I mean, I guess a few reflections from me, a bit from the coalface of trying to work on some of these issues with different donors. More recently looking at politics of service delivery and public goods delivery and what politics and governance can bring to bear on those issues. But I guess also feeling some of the pressure, which I think you allude to and which Owen has put nicely on the table for us about, you know, why are we not quite living up to expectations perhaps, or why have we not got there yet, and what else is it going to take? And I have a couple of reflections, one on the how and one on the donor politics, if I may. And I think, I mean, it's interesting that you talk a lot about the inconsistency in language, the fact that even with the politics and governance field, we're talking about governance, people are using it to refer to all sorts of different things, and I think that's absolutely right. I think it's also true that actually the challenge is then if you're thinking about how that applies to development assistance more broadly, you know, a health person, a water engineer has a fundamentally different understanding of what governance means or what incentives are or what institution means. And I think that what some of our work has tried to do is actually to start with kind of going down to the health advisor who's struggling with a chronic problem that's been recurring over many years, and actually they've been putting money into, they've been doing technical assistance, and it's still not getting fixed, and they think that maybe politics is having an effect, but they don't really know how to make sense of that. And I think we've seen a lot of examples. We've seen examples of, you know, why is there persistent medicine stockouts in so many countries despite so many reform efforts? And what are the institutions and the incentives which are kicking in? Why is it that, you know, in rural areas you can't get teachers or health workers to stay in posts despite the fact that they should be according to, you know, the formal system commitments? So I think what we've found is actually if you start with the bottleneck, and the problem, whether it's for an aid program or whether it's for a broader service delivery program, and you try to work out from there what the political and governance implications are, it brings you much more quickly to the how and the operational issues. But what we still lack, I think, although we're building it up, it takes time, is the shared language, the way of actually bringing a governance person and a health person together to work through that kind of a problem. And we've been doing some work with colleagues from University of Birmingham, Richard Batley and Claire McLaughlin, who are in the corner, to actually start with mapping the technical characteristics of sectors that themselves have inbuilt, you know, governance and political implications, the monopoly of supply that can occur around medicine supply chains, the demand dynamics, which will vary if you're talking about rural sanitation versus primary education. So I think, you know, we need to sort of start there and work out, and that we've found seems to be getting traction. I would say also just very quickly that we've tended to talk a lot about donors and aid and what they can do, and I think your book nicely acknowledges that there are limits to what donors can do in relation to some of these problems and dynamics. And actually what we've found is it's helpful to look down almost a level to, if you like, some of the intermediaries, those who perhaps are delivering services, those who are on the front line, local actors as well as international NGOs and others. I've done work with organisations like Plan, like Tear Fund, as well as local organisations who actually really know what the political realities are. And if you have the right people in the right place, they actually can have a fair amount of room for manoeuvre to adapt, to innovate, to respond to local conditions and incentives. But actually aren't always given the space to do that by donors who demand certain log frames and templates and ways of working. And I think actually thinking about this revolution and how it plays out sort of from the bottom up, I think is quite helpful and links a lot to other literature at the moment, whether it's Matt Andrews' work on more kind of problem-driven, iterative approaches, David Booth's work on arm's length assistance. But actually, let's think about who actually can be empowered to work on this and how we do that. And then I'd say just very briefly, because one of the other areas that's very close to my heart is donor politics, and the realities of the dynamics around how donor agencies and governments relate to their own publics. And we did some research over the last year looking at public opinion here in the UK and looking around the country at what different groups of citizens kind of felt and what their views were on development. And it was interesting to me working on governance, where so much of the comeback is, well, this sounds great, but we can't sell it back home because UK public doesn't want to hear about all of these messy, complex challenges that we have to deal with. And actually what we found is, you know, UK public, as all of us, is sort of up for it and can take it if only we find better ways of communicating to them. And they're kind of fed up with a very narrow story that we'll just give some money and it will work and we will save people's lives. They know that, you know, the sorts of countries in which we're working, it's probably not that simple, and they want to be told how we're going to address some of that. So I think there is a space for us here. I think there's other issues like party politics that can get in the way. But for public engagement, perhaps there's more opportunity.
Thank you very much, Lenny, for helping keep this discussion. Other questions and comments? There's one over there. Just wait for the mic.
Hi, great presentation. Florencia Gersvich from the Transparency and Accountability Initiative. My question is about a silo that I think you didn't talk about, which is what has been the role and what do you think is the comparative advantage, if any, of private philanthropy in all this story? If the revolution is almost done or done, is there a special role for private philanthropy to deepen it or move it forward? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you. There's one in front.
Joe Hanlon from Open University and LSE. One of the things that seems, I haven't read the book, so I can't comment on the book, but an undertone of the presentations is the whole point about politics and what we're doing is that still that we in the North have the answer, and that we are going to make our answers work. And whether it's a technocratic solution or whether it's a political solution, we are not asking the governments in the South and the people in the South what they think is the solution. And what strikes me, I mean, I work in Southern Africa, Mozambique, Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe, of course, aid is explicitly political for regime change. Nobody's asking the people of Zimbabwe what they think about this. Mozambique, it's interesting, where aid has actually become less political over the last few years, much more technocratic because of all this accountability requirements, and unaccountable to the extent that because of budget support, Parliament is not allowed to approve budgets anymore. They have to be approved by donors first. So there can be no public debate about budget choices because of the budget support structure. Now, Mozambique has a huge debate about development, has had debate about development for many years, but it's not taken into account because the donors all say that they have an answer, they have a way that it should be done. I mean, maybe we're dealing with politics from a northern perspective, and yet again, we're not asking what people think in the South.
Thank you. This one. While the microphone travels, let me remind you all that you can all join us for a glass of wine at the end of this discussion before you all go home.
Thanks very much. Can't wait to read the book. My name is Vincent Gasana. I'm a journalist and program maker, although I'm not working at all tonight, so I'm just here interested. Just listening to all that, is that any kind of awareness or discomfort with the fact that the aid sector has almost become an alternative government? Because there's an awful lot of very sophisticated work being done in different sectors by various people, whether it be academics and research, whether it be the books have just written, people talking about the best way of encouraging good governance, the best way of encouraging health sector. So pretty much everything that a government would be doing for its people, for its nation, is being done from elsewhere. and we're talking about the very title of the book, The Revolution. I mean, revolution necessarily entails some kind of paradigm shift. So you're changing something fundamental in someone else's responsibilities. So in the mere fact that you're asking a question means the revolution's pretty much been achieved. And as I understand it, there is a debate as to whether or not people ought to be more politically engaged to effect change, or whether they just simply ought to be purely technocratic. I mean, I would say that that horse is already bolted, because if you're doing all of these things, you are, in effect, engaging in politics. You cannot do anything to do with development in any society without really pretty much being political. So it is politics. The question is, what kind of politics? And it is, we're getting to a stage where now, certainly in Africa, but maybe other development countries, if they do any forward planning at all, they have to factor into the fact of what the NGOs will do, what the other governments will do. I mean, that is really, I find, quite extraordinary. So it is pretty much governed from elsewhere. It suggests one gets some sympathy for what the Bolivians are trying to do. So it sounds as if something, the wires in his brain just short-circuited and just said, we've got to stop all of this, and did something as mad as stopping things.
Thank you. Let me take 2 more questions, then maybe let me have Tan and Diane give a chance to respond. There is James first on the way, and then Heidi and Brim. Sorry, there's James here. I think it was
James Dean from BBC Media Action. It's a fascinating conversation already. I guess my question from the title is the almost revolution rather infers that we are almost there, or that there is something there to be achieved. And just picking up on what Owen was saying, is that a sense that you actually, with a bit more effort and a few more things to be done, there can be much more rational, much more sensible, much more political contextualization of development spending and action, which is actually likely to be effective. And I guess the question I'm asking that is actually coming back to what Owen was saying in terms of, I'm a great believer in political economy analysis, not least because of work by Marta and others, but I was at a meeting of donors a couple of weeks ago in Paris, and they were all saying everyone's doing political economy analysis now. Obviously, everyone is doing political economy analysis, and they said what we really need to do is to coordinate all our work around political economy analysis and make sure we're not duplicating it. And I kind of got the sense it was a conversation about political economy analysis rather than actually trying to solve the problem of why political economy analysis is there in the first place, which is to understand and work within the context and complexity of politics in countries. And maybe what I think you're inferring, Owen, is that suggests a much more radical structural upheaval within a development system, which is simply not equipped to deal with the how you actually do work within the confines of what this book is suggesting. So I guess my bottom line question is actually any of this actually possible without a completely radical overhaul of a development system or not, or a bit more tweaking and we're almost there?
Thank you, James. Heidi and Brim, and then I'll get back to the panel, and there will be opportunities for more questions shortly.
Hi, my name's Heidi Tavakoli, and I work within the Centre for Aid and Public Expenditure at ODI. Building on some of the work that the POGO team have been doing recently, we have carried out some research to examine what has enabled aid programmes that have tried to address specific governance constraints to service delivery. What has enabled them to do it effectively. And our conclusions suggest that there are certain types of activities as well as certain enabling factors that allow for these aid programmes to address these specific constraints. And in terms of the enabling factors, we noticed that actually aid programmes and aid implementers or implementing agencies tend to be more like facilitators rather than policy advisors. And they are bringing people together and bearing the transaction cost of that process so they can solve the problems themselves. And sort of building on what Owen said, actually allowing them to be problem-driven, iterative and adaptive. And to do that, the donors have to actually emulate these practices themselves. And so that leads on then to my second point, which is more of a question. Given that, as you say, one of the challenges of actually creating a full revolution is that donors are increasingly pressurized to measure the value for money of governance programs. How do you suggest they do that in an effective way? And I think effective is the important point here, because value for money is not just about the efficiency of spend. It's not just actually what can you achieve with less inputs, but actually it's how can we achieve effective outcomes. So I put that as a question to the panel. If you were actually designing the value for money framework for governance initiatives in DFID, how would you go about and do that?
Thank you. Heidi Bryn.
Hi there, I'm Bryn Wellham, a research fellow also in the Centre for Aid and Public Expenditure. Just maybe one quick question or maybe clarification, which the book may make clear. We're talking a lot about the politics and development and technocratic versus political approaches. Are you saying that, is your book referring to development interventions or aid interventions which are designed to change the political systems of the countries you're working in? Or are you talking about doing technocratic work in a more politically informed way, say through political economy analysis? Because it would be possible to be quite technocratic using a political economy analysis just to understand what's going on in your sector and tweaking your intervention in that way, which is not such a big deal. And then there is, or these days people seem to think that's not such a big deal, that's how everyone should work. And then there's the big picture, making you a democracy, making you a liberal democratic state. I wonder, in the discussion and what I'm hearing, it's confusing, or it's mixing those two together. So which is the priority of, well, not the priority, what's the conclusion? Or I could just read the book, but we'll see.
Do that, it's great.
Thank you, Bryn. Tom and Diane, quite a lot to respond to.
Yeah.
Is the revolution actually won?
Well, you know, in France, when they talk about 1968, they say it was almost a revolution. And they mean it failed. You know, it doesn't mean it was achieved except for a few things around the edges. And so it's purposely ambiguous because we think it's up for grabs. That the aid community is actually, we don't know which way it's going to go. There's, I think, the potential of achieving some genuine insights and a deeper approach to assistance, both in terms of goals and in methods. But it's also possible, as Owen was describing, there is a continual haunting voice which he articulated, even though he might not be an advocate for it, of a back to basics, of let's just do what we know we can do. I mean, I think I don't have very much sympathy with the back to basics because we've failed on basics in some countries for 50 years. We actually know it's good if kids go to school and learn something. A lot of countries don't have schools where kids go and learn something. So if it's so simple, how come we don't just go back to that basic? You know, the back to basics doesn't, I think, actually ring true with experience in many cases. The whole reason this erupted in many in many places was a feeling of we're not getting to the basics. And so now let me just pick up a few things, and Deanne may want to add a couple of things. Joe Handlin, your question, your comment. If we gave that impression, I'm sorry, because that's not what we're trying to do in our analysis here. Is particularly if we start with methods, I think we would argue that politically smarter assistance starts with listening to people in the society and saying, what is it you're trying to do here? What are your goals and objectives? Let's listen to it. Is there some way that resonates with what we could do or we could be helpful on, and proceed from there? Some of the most, we give some examples of programs that we think are fairly well informed and flexible and politically nuanced in their methods, for, like Change Coalition projects, where you start, the whole purpose is you get together with a group of local actors in the country, you get together with them and you listen to them, and you spend 6 months or a year in which they identify the biggest challenges that they feel to the betterment of human life in their society, and come and say, here's the things we think are most important and where we see some opportunities. Now, can you work with us? Can you help us? Do you have some knowledge from other societies that might be helpful? And so it's the opposite of coming and saying, we know what your problem is, it's this. And so that isn't the thrust of what we're trying to do. And now, at the same time, and this is the deep tension which the book embodies, because it is a deep tension, having political goals does mean, I think I know what better governance is, democratic governance is. We think in general it's a good thing when governments are accountable to their people, that they listen to their people and take them account. We think it's generally better when governments don't systematically exclude certain people from power and marginalize them. We think it's better when governments are representative in some way of theirs, and so forth. And if you say, aha, now you're imposing your political system on us, yes, that's true. In a sense, you come to a point where you say, you're right, I have certain political beliefs, and they say, why do you believe that? it's either intrinsic or it's instrumental. You think, because I just think that's how humans should be treated. Or it's because I think over the long term that's going to produce better results in sort of how your state responds to the needs of citizens. So you're right, guilty is charged in that sense, but I don't think in the more simplistic sense you mentioned. And I think that's similar, Vincent, to your, when you say aid has become an alternative government in many places. I'd say that's true in a small number of very aid-dependent countries where the assistance community generally is so deeply involved in the budget and the state institutions and so forth that aid really is playing that role. And again, in some ways it's a reaction to that problem and of undercutting the state and telling other people what to do and not being responsive to the population that leads to a desire to do things better. So again, it's not let's take over states and run them. It's a little bit the opposite kind of. And actually many states, there are a lot of states receiving assistance that are not in this situation. Bolivia can say goodbye to the United States because it's not aid dependent. It was sort of nice having a little bit of extra help on the agriculture and the health projects, but they can leave. They can either get Venezuela to contribute some money or China or do it themselves. And Indonesia doesn't particularly need all the assistance it gets from Western aid providers, but they actually find it useful in some ways. There's a big world of aid receiving countries that are not taken over by the assistance community and in which there's a more dynamic relationship. James, I agree with you that we say when we have a section when we talk about political economy analysis that there's a bit of a Zeno's paradox quality to this. Is that you sort of, the development community is getting close to what the real problem is, and that's what Owen put his finger right on the jugular in reading the quote you did, which is, it may be that deep down, if we face what we're really trying to do, we would acknowledge to ourselves we have neither the power nor the knowledge to do that. I would like us to face that and then make those decisions in an informed way. We've been avoiding that for 50 years in some ways. And that's what I'm tired of, kind of, and I feel like, and so you're right, the discussion about political economy analysis, it's paradox, you get halfway there, and then you just sit around and talk about different forms of political, and you're just like, and we have a session here called Towards Superficial Forms of Political Knowledge, that you end up just reproducing the problem of the technocracy within the political debate, and it goes on, and it sort of drives you crazy when you see it happening and such, and all you have to do is go to Brussels and listen to a debate on let's be political and want to run out of the room, we're live streaming. But they're saying that's not what we had in mind, kind of. And so this is deep, and I agree with you, and I'm glad you raised it. This is the question, but I wouldn't put it in such all or nothing terms that we know nothing versus we have the answer. We're starting to get some small insights, and that's what Lenny was talking about, and her colleague Heidi and others it's at the sort of and that's what David Booth's work has been. Is there are places where a more informed method and sort of pursuing these things leads you at least to some insights about, I see, local service delivery will respond more to these kind of incentives. We're not sort of arguing for a new technocracy, but we're saying, taking it on with a large jaw and saying we know exactly what's right politically for this country and here's the answer, it's probably a mistake, and instead it's going to be lots of small bites of the apple. It doesn't have to mean technocracy. It doesn't mean it's a work program for political scientists to finally give them some steady employment everywhere in the world. And we actually don't highlight political scientists because this kind of knowledge isn't political science. It's sociology, it's anthropology, it's the fabric of everyday life. Actually, political scientists aren't necessarily the ones to do that. And so we sort of avoid this idea that either we know enough that we have the answers, or we don't know anything. That's why it's an almost revolution. We think we're somewhere in between. Deanne, do you want to mention if there are one or two things that might
So quickly, just on Bryn's question at the end, the distinction we draw between politically smart methods and political goals is exactly the distinction you pointed out between, is this just about the political method side is all of our programs, let's just be politically smarter about them. And the goals side is, okay, we actually want to change political systems. And I think most of the politics agenda in development is so sort of broad and touches so many different areas that in a way there isn't a single sort of thing that would happen that we would say, okay, the politics revolution has been accomplished. And often what Owen talked about in terms of changing political systems, we highlight those challenges in the conclusion mainly to say, probably that's not where this is going. Probably this is not about saying, okay, how can we go in and completely transform a country's political system and turn it into a democracy? What the interesting learning on political methods and on political goals is quite similar to, I think, what Owen highlighted in a very good lecture on development as a complex system, which you should all listen to, and in some good blog posts on the subject, that it should be about both understanding the system and how complex it is, and the interrelated parts, which I think is a powerful argument for political goals in the sense of not concentrating just on sort of how do we improve sort of vaccine delivery in one area, or how do we get more kids in school in one area, and thinking more about how all of these are connected, and are there sort of underlying political blockages which we might not be able to totally remove, but we can at least try to sort of push in a good direction. And on methods, what Owen calls nudging, what David Booth calls arm's length approaches, of now that we understand more about the political situation, this might actually make us less ambitious in our goals and make us realize that development aid really should be more of a facilitating role, and trying to figure out where can aid play a productive role in these local processes. And also, where is our aid being inconsistent? I mean, a big problem with the integration agenda has been, okay, we have adopted accountability and transparency and participation as principles, but yet when all of this adds up, it turns into governments actually having their domestic accountability undermined because of all these donor demands, or problems like you pointed out. But taking a sort of political systems approach would require actually saying, okay, what are all of our programs in the society doing? Are we really promoting sort of systems of domestic accountability rather than just all these isolated interventions? And there's been some thinking about that on sort of the role of taxation, and the OECD DAC has done a recent big report on domestic accountability systems, and how do we sort of make sure the whole country is getting pushed in a positive direction. But donors are still very sort of early stages of figuring out what that would mean in practice.
Owen, do you have something to add? In that case, let me open the next round of questions with a question to you by somebody who's following online. Becky Carter from the Governance and Social Development Resource Centre in the UK. Owen distinguishes between development aid and aid that aims to improve people's lives but may not bring about development. But building on Lenny's contribution, doesn't aid to improve people's lives also require tackling incentives and institutional bottlenecks that impede service delivery and therefore will require political methods? And another one from our online audience, how does the interrelationship between development and humanitarian intervention look when the revolution is complete? David, you've been, your name is floating out. David was a sociologist, by the way. Do you want to
can I also
make an
ask the discussant a question? David Booth at ODI. I want to also probe the discussant's question, because the discussant's comments I thought were, I mean, particularly good by the standards of these things.
There's a lot of ODI events.
not Owen standards, but no, I've had bad experiences with discussants lately. I mean, first of all, this question of, well, we don't really know how to do it. I mean, I think that's clearly true in several of the respects that clearly are highlighted in the book. But let's not overdo this. I mean, I think that there is a certain convergence, which might even be shared by Acemoglu and Robinson, actually, over this question of adaptiveness, which I think, I mean, it's very prominent in Matt Andrews' recent book, and in the other working papers from the Kennedy Center and from the Center of Global Development. I think we do know that understanding how to make systems more oriented to problem solving and to learning and to adaptation is a formula that's going to work in most contexts, and it doesn't involve imposition of sort of alien remedies on people. Quite the contrary, it is all about encouraging people to address problems and work that way. but I mean, one would have to admit that this is another example of learning going around in circles, because that whole theme was very prominent in the 1980s, and it's been forgotten about since. So we're going back to the 1980s, and there may even have been an earlier cycle as well, and all of that discussion about process projects and adaptive systems was there. So, well, I suppose my question to Owen is, would you not recognise that there is in fact a considerable convergence there, and that therefore the question of what are the political constraints on the donor side to actually picking up this sort of consensus among the experts, it makes that question still very relevant. And I'd particularly like to hear in what sense he thinks that we need a richer analysis of the politics of the donor side, of the aid business itself. In what particular aspects is the current analysis lacking?
Maybe I'll take another couple and then we can go back particularly to Owen and the panel. And apologies, the question about humanitarian aid was from Jonathan Alger, who's executive member of Bright Blue in London.
Thank you. My name is Karen Whitus. I have been working in this field for a very long time, but from the rule of law and democracy and governance side, and I teach a course in that now. And I wanted to return to the thing that Deanne said, which was really interesting, about instrumental versus intrinsic value of the governance side of things, which is usually kind of a word that people use when they really mean democracy, but they don't want to say it. And that's really what we mean. And whether you think that these are only reconcilable up to a certain point. And I have to say that your presentation is only the second time in very recent times that I've heard people actually acknowledge that there may be a trade-off, that you may have to sacrifice some of the developmental goals, not all of them, but a certain degree, for some of these other achievements in society, and that it's not the imposition of a Western liberal democracy, but there's a lot of survey data from all these regional barometers that when you ask people what kind of government they prefer, the indicators are very strong on the democracy side. And is that then a problem for the donors? I'm sure the development people will jump on my head for this. But to allow a community, a country, the citizens of a country, to choose to give up some of the development gains in exchange for some of the governance and democracy gains.
Another question here, and I'll take one more, and then I think I'll give the chance to the panel to go back for some final comments.
I'm Stephen Jones. I'm a PhD student here in London. You've touched on this briefly in relation to sort of other trends in politics and aid, but I wondered if the increased focus on funding towards fragile states is one of the challenges to this sort of debate, or if it's an opportunity because it's clearly so important to be sensitive to politics in that scenario.
One more over there.
Hi, my name is Sue Griffiths. I work for Global Partners. I just wanted to go back to what you said at the beginning about the game you played with policy papers and guess the decade from the buzzword. And I wondered if you saw in that either a gradual evolution towards this revolution, or almost revolution that you're describing, or whether it was actually more of a disjointed wave of different fads that were not building up to this one thing. And if it's the latter, I also wondered if you had a concern that this politics fixation is our latest fad, if you like, and if we don't manage to do it well, or if we decide it's too hard, then next decade it'll be something else instead.
Okay, let me get back to the panel. Owen first, given that a few questions were addressed to him directly.
Thank you, Marta. So the book makes a really interesting and important distinction between delivering aid in a politically savvy way. So how do you prevent stockouts in clinics? Well, you've got to understand the politics of who's controlling the drugstores and who's benefiting from it and so on. And the bigger question of, or a different question of, how do you change power relationships in a society that will enable more equitable growth, less extractive institutions, and so on, using Acemoglu and Robinson's terminology, which you don't do. But so there's one set of questions about how do you understand politics to solve particular service delivery questions or other similar questions, and then there's a separate issue, which is to what extent and how might you go about trying to change the politics of a country, whether either at national or at subnational level. And it seems to me that there should be nobody left who doesn't think we should be doing the first of those, right? That you'd be insane to be thinking about how do we get better teaching in schools if you're not thinking about the power of teacher unions, or the respective role of the Minister of Education and so on. Now we've had some experience of that's been positive and successful, and where people have thought through the politics, and this is what incidentally our own governments do every day. When I worked in the Treasury and there was some either sensible or not so sensible idea for some economic reform, you start off by asking the question, who's going to lose from this, and what are we going to buy them off with? What are we going to give them instead, right? That's how you do reform in any country. You think through the politics, and it's always been very weird in development that we've not done enough of that. We've wanted not to get involved in that politics, and we have to be involved in that politics. And all the best people working in development have been. All the best examples of where development has been successful has been doing that. That's a very different question, as your book is very clear about, than from the kind of to what extent should we be engaged in the macro politics of a country. And there and this comes partly to David's question and point. I agreed with, I think, with everything that David said. But I feel more confident that we know how to do those smaller questions of how do you do politically savvy interventions than I feel confident in thinking about, do we know how to bring about changes in power relationships more broadly. I think we might well be able to see after the event where change has successfully occurred and what has contributed to that. But it's very hard to know in advance what the impact will be of some kind of intervention that you think might make the world a better place. Some, support for an opposition party, or we've had, and you describe in the book, examples where there's been a movement in DFID and in other aid agencies to identify reformers and support them, right? And you say in the book, well-meaning, but it hasn't worked. Okay, I think that's broadly true. That's consistent with my experience. There probably are examples where it has worked, but I think, broadly speaking, this idea that you're going to back reformers, too simplistic, too mechanical. And then I heard you talking about, well, so now we're going to back coalitions. Yeah, maybe that will work, or maybe it won't, and maybe it will have unforeseen consequences. Maybe, it's very hard to predict what the long-run effects of these things will be, and we should remember that we've had a pretty mixed record of intervening in developing countries, partly because we've done it for very mixed motives, and partly because it's really hard to do well. And so I'm not completely with David in saying, well, we kind of do know how to do this. We kind of do know how to do the politically savvy intervention stuff. I'm not convinced that we know how to do the bringing up, helping accelerate changes in power relationships in developing countries. And if you read the Acemoglu and Robinson book, one of the things that's very striking is they talk about these critical junctures and the idea that societies can go off in different directions. And the different directions depend on really difficult to predict, rather small-looking differences in the initial conditions. The effect of the Black Death, of the plague, in Eastern Europe was very different from the effect of the Black Death in Western Europe, because of things to do with land ownership structure and the position of cities and all kinds of interesting things. I just think we have to accept that it's very hard to know how a small shock to a complex system, it's very hard to know where that's going to take that system. And I think we should acknowledge that. And that does lead us, I think, then to these questions of how do you improve feedback loops and the way that systems adapt themselves, and hopefully take those systems in a more sensible direction. But I think the criticism, my view that we should be thinking about adaptiveness, I think somewhat suffers from the same criticism, that there's still the risk of quite significant unforeseen consequences of that. So I just think this is genuinely a very difficult space to be in, to be trying to bring about political change in other people's countries. I think that answers Becky's question, and I'll shut up because
Tom and Diane, do you want to say something?
Sure, I'll just say something quickly. On that point, I think there is a big temptation to do the methods without the goals, and that the case, as you said, is very clear for let's be politically smart, and let's not worry about trying to change political systems. But the problem there is, at a minimum, donors need to understand how all their little interventions are affecting the system, and whether they're creating parallel systems, and whether sort of lots of interventions that individually are politically smart are adding up to big political problems in the society. So at a minimum, there's sort of a responsibility to be aware of the systemic effects. But also there is potential to sort of push the system in a positive direction without trying to completely transform it. But aid to civil society has been criticized for many good reasons, but at the same time, in places like Ethiopia, part of the reason why the government wants to shut down civil society, foreign funding for civil society, is that that's actually had quite a big impact in empowering some human rights NGOs and empowering some voices that would not otherwise have a chance to push themselves, the political system, in a way that we don't know exactly where it will go, but it seems sort of to be pushed in a positive direction. And that relates to the question about conflict and affected fragile states, which was a very big push in the 2000s for donors on both goals and methods, in that they realized working in conflict-affected states that you can't just work on education, you can't just work on health without taking the basic political problems into account. And that led to the rise of conflict assessments, which had political economy elements, and DFID's work on political settlements. But it also went beyond sort of conflict states in particular to inspire some rethinking about development in other countries, because practitioners who were working in Afghanistan, for example, and saying, really none of our projects are going to work unless we solve some of the basic governance issues of corruption and of lack of legitimacy of the state. Practitioners working in more stable countries that are not clearly conflict affected said, this actually is an issue for us as well. And so that was an important intellectual driver within the aid community.
Well, just 1 minute. I know we're past time. I didn't get to Francis' question about private foundations. I've had a lot of contact with the private foundation world in the U.S., particularly the Open Society Foundation, but others. What's interesting is, in a way, they have greater freedom because they're often driven by one person and the vision of that person, and they can go in very different directions. Compare the two largest private foundations in the U.S. that work in this sector at all, the Gates Foundation and the Soros Foundations. Compare two men, Bill Gates and George Soros. Bill Gates, the ultimate technocrat. There's a scientific solution to problems. We're going to get that vaccine, and we're going to end malaria. It's the pure technocratic dream. And the Gates Foundation, at least in its first wave of efforts in the developing world, was the epitome of 1960s-style technological solutionism. But because they're smart and serious, they're working towards more nuanced and more complex ideas. George Soros was the opposite, a man who believes in a sense, the triumph of the human spirit, the complexity of an open society. That all you really need to do is help open a society. They'll figure out what to do. Just help them open. His idea is very much that's how he made the money in the financial markets. Is he has an intuitive and organic understanding of how markets work, and he knows when to jump in and when to jump out. And he views development very much in that same way. And so for him, it was all about my foundations will be completely immersed in the local context, run by local staff members, boards of directors that are there, highly local institutions immersed in them. So it's fascinating that private foundations can be much more flexible and try things that official donor agencies can't even dream of. Concentrating their resources, taking risks, and so forth. Let's end with just the final comment. The woman there, sorry, I didn't catch your name there in the back, because that's the key question. Is this just a fad which will come back in 10 years and say, people remember when they used to write books about Paul? Boy, that was a long time ago. Actually, I don't think so. Not just because it's going to stay in print for a while, but this isn't just another fad. There are fads galore. I've spent my career popping bubbles of fads. I mean, I like to do that, actually. Part of the reason we wrote this book is this isn't. This is an attempt at in a 50 or 60-year enterprise, there was, and David's absolutely right, and we chronicle in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, plenty of people who raised these very questions, tried interesting experiments, not just Hirschman, a whole series of voices, and went around in circles, but there was a significant change in the early 1990s that has changed the development community approach, and we're now, as I said, 20 to 25 years into that. It's not a 10-year thing, and it's because, as I said in the answer to James, is we're finally approaching the real issues about should we just focus on these little narrow goals in a smart way, but then that bleeds up into the whole system. What is the relationship between politically smart at the local level and then trying to actually affect the system? We're finally there at the intersection of power and assistance and change, and the question, almost revolution, is whether we're capable of grasping it in an effective way.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you all. Two takeaway message from me. I've heard this is deep, but there is a role for the small bites, and I agree with Tom that these small bites are taking us close to the big questions. They don't answer perhaps the big questions. Perhaps as long as we don't fall into the trap of becoming technocratic ourselves in the way we go about it and in our frameworks and methods, I think we stand a chance to get a bit closer. I think we need to take the plunge to get a bit closer, and where we need to go, I think, is on the politics of donor, and I think it is the politics of donor countries, not just the politics of aid, but the broader context for international engagement, which I think Owen reminded us all about. Thank you all very much for coming, for those of you who are here and for our online audience, and a special thanks to our panelists who were entertaining and insightful, and I look forward to seeing you soon. More of these kind of events to come. We have an event next week on citizens, the role of citizens in fighting corruption with Claire Landon-Mills that my colleague Alina will chair. Matt Andrews, been mentioned a few times, is coming to London soon. It will be a CGD on the 20th of May and here at ODI on the 21st. So more of this kind of discussions to come very soon. Thank you, everybody.